And this part, probably the most important one, the lighting, the thing that can make or break your scene. And really, it is probably the most important thing you can do when you're working with 3D. Of course, you need all of the modeling skills and all of the technical skills to create the scene. But if you are not able to light it properly or in some nice way, basically all the work is lost, because if you cannot present your technical skills and your modeling skills in a beautifully lighted scene, then it was all in vain. So really the lighting is probably the most important thing you can learn when working with 3D, and it's a topic on its own. So here we'll be using mostly very simple, easy lighting techniques, but we'll use them in a way that make our scenes stand out. So first of all, we can see we have already light in the scene, the simple point light that was placed by the default scene in the beginning. And we can use it to demonstrate how different lights behave in Blender. But before we do, let's set up some render settings. So let's go here to the render settings. And you can see the render engine is now set to Eevee. This is the real-time engine that's powering the material preview as well. So that's basically the engine we are in right now. Of course, it can be made nicer and it can be made to react to the scene lights, but by default this material preview is using the Eevee engine. So now only thing that changes, if you switch to the render preview, the Eevee engine will start to react to lights. Now if you press G and start moving the lights, you can see how the scene reacts. And there are basically two main types of lights here in Blender, and there are lights that have fall off and there are lights that are only directional. In this case it's sunlight. So point light has a fall off, so if I press G then Z and start moving it closer to the object, you will see it shines more and more light on the surface, and if I go further away it gives less and less light, like this. So this is a light with a fall off. Basically it has some kind of limit on how far it can shine. Now let's press X and delete the light, and this is basically the unlit scene, but it's not completely dark, and it's possible due to something called world settings right here, and that's integral part of the lighting. So if you click here to the world settings, you will see there's a color, and basically that's the color that kind of surrounds your scene and gives some basic light. So for example, if you click here and go all the way to black, you would finally get nothing, no lights in the scene, no world lights. So you can think of this as a skylight or something like that. So let's go back a little bit here, and now let's press Shift A and we'll add a light, and we'll add a sunlight. The spotlight and area lights are another type of lights that have different properties, but similar to point light, they have fall off. So if you select the sunlight, you will now see this is lit, but no matter where the light is, we'll get the same quality of light. So as you can see, the sunlight is placed in the middle of the scene right here, and it shines on our object anyway. So if you press G then Z and move it up and down, absolutely nothing changes. There's no fall off because it acts kind of like a real sun. It doesn't matter if you're on the ground floor or if you're on the top of the skyscraper, the sun will still kind of shine the same on you. Of course, there might be differences, but for the purpose of the 3D software and illustration, it's the same. So right now we can just press R and rotate the sunlight, and you will see it will cast shadows. So it reacts to the rotation because it's directional, but it doesn't have any fall off. So we can now just press R and rotate it to the side, so it gives nice shadows to the side here like this, and that'll be our basic light for the scene. Now let's just make it a little bit stronger. So let's go to the data properties for the light, and let's increase the strength to something like 3. And now already we have some illustration that has some light quality. There are some shadows in the scene. There are some brighter parts, some darker parts. So already this looks a little bit better. But I like to use Cycles engine, which is a path tracer engine, as opposed to Eevee, which is a real-time, and it more simulates the lighting and shadows as something like games, for example, whereas the cycles, that's the realistic render engine, and of course more demanding, so it will take longer to render out your scene. So let's go back to the render settings and let's switch this to cycles, and you will see the difference right away. But first I want to make some adjustments. So let me go back to the material preview. And before we start taking advantage of the Eevee, let's set it up. You can see the device is set to CPUs, so the cycles will try to render this out on your CPU. If you have a GPU like NVIDIA card or something like that, take advantage of that. And first of all, you cannot only go here and switch to GPU, you need to go edit preferences, choose system. And now here you have a bunch of different options, and all of this is for a different chip manufacturer. So for example, CUDA and optics are for NVIDIA cards, HIP is for AMD, and one API is for Intel GPUs. So whichever card you have, if you have like a modern Intel GPU or you have AMD, Radeon or something like that, pick your choice right here. So for example, for the RTX GPUs from NVIDIA, you will go for optics, and then make sure the box is checked right here in the preferences. And now it makes sense to switch the CPU to GPU compute, and you will see the difference in speed right away. So for example, when I switch to rendered right now, it's almost immediate, and I can zoom in and the sampling happens in much faster way. And I have a fast CPU already, but this is much faster already. Now the second thing that we can do for better previews, faster previews, is to enable denoising. Now you can see in the sampling section of our cycles render, you can choose samples. You have two different categories. You have viewport and render. Viewport is, as you might probably guessed, the viewport that we have right here when we're working on our designs, when we're editing, that's the viewport. And render is when we're doing the final render for our illustration. So for the viewport, you can set the max samples. It doesn't really matter too much, but I will limit that to 512, so we're not doing so many samples in the viewport, all for nothing. And for the render, by default, these are 4000 samples, which is quite a lot, and it will take a lot of time for like weaker GPUs, not talking about CPU. So it's best to reduce this. And for starters, you can start at somewhere like 512, but you can go even lower if you have like a weak GPU or like a weaker laptop. Don't worry about this. For learning purposes, it's okay to go for even like 64 samples or something like that. And that will determine the length your final animation or your final illustration will take. And now we'll take advantage for denoising, and you can see there are two of those. The one is for viewport again, and one is for the render. And by default for the render, there's open image denoise from Intel. I tend to switch this to optics. The open image has better results in my opinion, but optics is for me a little bit faster, so I tend to use it, and then maybe for some really final render I will use the open image. So let me collapse this, and I will enable denoising for the viewport as well, and I will leave it at automatic. It will probably use the optics, or you can just force the option right here. Doesn't really matter. And now if I enable render preview, you won't even see those ray tracing dots there, and it will be blazing fast. So it just happens like this, and this is almost real time. So for a simple illustration like this, there's basically no reason, if you have a good GPU, there's basically no reason to use Eevee when you're doing final lighting. That's most important to say. I'm using solid view and material view when I'm working on my models and textures and materials and stuff like that. But the moment I go into lighting and I plan to use cycles for the final render, I use cycles viewport with denoising. So let's go back to the camera view by pressing 0 on a numpad. And now with everything set up, we can save some performance by limiting the render preview only for the camera bounce, and you can do that using Ctrl B. So press Ctrl B and just drag a selection here. And now this is the complete setup I have when I'm working with the lighting. And basically this illustration is almost good as is.